We're joined by Lindsay Burris from Ingham ISD in Mason.
Hi folks, my name is Lindsay Burris and I am a research and instructional data consultant at the Ingham ISD, which essentially means that I get to help our schools find and implement evidence-based best practices and then use data to ensure that those decisions are having a positive impact on student outcomes. So I'm super excited to be here. One of my personal research interests is the science of learning, which fits perfectly with formative assessment. So yeah, thanks for having me.
This is session 3 of 517 EdTech's Digital Instruction Network. We are trying to create space for teachers to have some conversations about the things they're struggling with and learn some ways to make this digital instruction that we're all kind of working through as effective as possible. So once again, we are going to talk about considerations for effective formative assessment. One of the things that formative assessment has as a sort of good thing and a bad thing is that it's a term we're all really familiar with. And the problem with a familiar term is that often we start all feeling like we know what it means and we don't have to worry too much about it anymore. And formative assessment has with it the potential to be an extremely value-adding feature in your classroom, but only if it's done right. And that's true of all things, of course. Anything that can add a lot of value can be done right or be done wrong. But this is one where the potential is really, really, really high to have a very positive impact. And we want to make sure that we are showing and talking about the ways to make sure it is as effective as possible. So over the next hour, we're going to try and answer the following questions, okay? We're going to try and answer the question, how can we create a system for formative assessment as an authentic value add to your classroom? Okay, what does it look like to create that system? And we do mean system. Formative assessments aren't events. Formative assessment is a system. Number 2, why should you balance graded and ungraded formative assessment opportunities? Okay, or potentially, and we're going to get into this, maybe not grade formative assessment at all, if that's a possibility for you. And then the third question is, how many tech tools does it take for a teacher to have an effective formative assessment system? Okie dokie. So let's spend a few minutes getting on the same page about what formative assessment is and why it has become so important in education. So why don't you head over to the chat and type in one word that you would use to describe formative assessment. Okay, so those are all pretty positive. Checkpoint, check-in, check, right? These are all kind of the same kind of thought process that we're at a moment in time kind of taking the temperature, right? We are moving the students from a starting spot through a process to a mastery spot. And at any given moment, we want to see where they are on that journey, okay? Because where they are depends on what we're going to do, or where they are will inform what we have to do next with them, right?
So this quote by Dylan Willem, who is one of the leading formative assessment researchers, kind of summarizes a lot of the same ideas that you all threw into the chat. He writes that assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. So it is only through assessment that we can find out whether what has happened in the classroom has produced the learning that we intended. Now, before I took this job, I spent some time as a special education teacher, so I've been in the classroom, and I know the unfortunate reality is that for some reason, our students don't always learn what it is we teach them. And so if they did, we wouldn't need things like grades or report cards or even assessments. We could just provide our administrators and parents with a list of all the content that we taught, and it would just be assumed that students had mastered that. But because that doesn't happen, and because what students learn as a result of our instruction is incredibly unpredictable, we need to monitor what they know and adjust our instruction accordingly. Some of you may be familiar with these two different terms already, assessment of learning and assessment for learning. Fun fact is that they originated in the UK, and they've gradually made their way to the United States thanks to some of the early work of Rick Stiggins, who's presented in this region a few different times. But according to the Michigan Assessment Consortium, assessment of learning is used when we seek to determine a learner's achievement, attainment, or progress. So it comprises what most schools would refer to as summative assessments or interim and benchmark assessments. In contrast, assessment for learning is intended to kind of monitor the ongoing teaching and learning in everyday classroom practice, as opposed to measuring it or summing it up. So assessment for learning is synonymous with formative assessment. And we'll use these terms interchangeably throughout this presentation, as you'll also see these terms used interchangeably in some of the extra resources that we're going to provide at the end. So we just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page regarding terminology. The origins of formative assessment date back to 1967. It became more common in the US in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but progressive research on formative assessment has shown that it's really powerful. According to research, students that are exposed to classroom formative assessment on average learn as much material in 8 months as students not exposed learn in 1 year. And this is for a variety of reasons. It's because formative assessment improves student learning. It increases student involvement. It supports students in identifying barriers to their own learning. It increases engagement. It gives students permission to make mistakes and to figure out where they're at in their learning, so they're naturally more motivated to buy in. Research out of the University of Kansas has suggested that formative assessment, while effective for all learners, is actually most effective with students who have the lowest levels of proficiency. So this is really good news for our struggling learners. Perhaps some of you guys have seen these benefits in your own classroom. There are different cycles, different lengths of cycles of assessment. We have short, medium, can you go back, Andrew? Thanks. Short, medium, and long. Those short cycles are the minute by minute and the day by day, the lesson by lesson. Longer cycles are like unit by unit or semester by semester. And in general, shorter cycles tend to lead to greater student achievement. So just think for a second, like in your own classroom, which of these do you tend to rely on most? Short, medium, or long? And then why do you think it is that shorter cycles are more effective?
Well, I think that as real time as it can be for students, especially, so I teach high school. And so like I have my students right now for 2.5 hours live a week. And as soon as they leave me, they're on to other things. So if I'm not giving them feedback like within the same class period, then their minds are already on to their football game tomorrow or their math class or whatever else.
Yeah, that's that's a great point. Feedback keeps bringing our students back. It keeps reminding them of what it is we're working on, and it keeps them with us.
There's a quote I want to pull out of there. I don't know if I got it word for word, but it's feedback while they're thinking about it. Like we're going to come back to that. Feedback is going to be part of this. And that's actually a really nice quote. I want to keep that in my mind. Laura says, I tend to rely on the short-term cycles because I usually want students to do something with the feedback pretty quickly.
That's fabulous. That's exactly what we want.
This is the process we're using for decision-driven data collection, which ordinarily we would talk about data-based decision-making, but we want to reframe that a little bit and talk about decision-driven data collection. So part of this has to do with recognizing how the data collection process really happens and what it needs to look like when you're doing it well. Okay, so it starts with the standard, right? Because those are the things that we're being asked to teach. The learning targets come out of that. And then the success criteria is really how you operationalize the learning target. So the learning target sometimes is really, really clear about what the success criteria looks like, and other times it's not. In addition to that, at times, the process of taking a group of students from a starting point in the learning process to a learning target is going to be something that progresses over time, maybe 3 or 4 class periods, as you guys are well aware. So success criteria after day 1 or day 2 of a multi-day learning process changes because you don't expect them to be at full mastery after day 1, but you also don't expect them to be right where they were. So trying to figure out what it looks like as they're progressing according to what you would expect them to progress, and then deciding how you formatively assess that. Because that's how you're going to make sense of what data you're looking for. After day 1, I would expect to see this. So I have to craft a formative assessment to gather that evidence. And then only then do you start really worrying about what tech tool you're going to use, not the other way around. And a lot of times we see the other way around. We're going to get this tech tool because it's really good for formative assessment, right? And then I'm going to bring this tech tool in and I'm going to do my formative assessments in this tech tool. Well, that's sort of backwards because you're starting with the tech tool and then you're going to frame all of your formative assessments so that that tech tool can do what it does. The right way to think about that is to choose through the standard learning target, success criteria, and then formative assessment design, and then choose the tech tool that's going to get you the evidence that you know you need to check the success criteria at any given moment. And this process is the process that just keeps cycling through and through and through, I mean, endlessly as you go through every learning target, every type of learning that you're going to be doing all the way throughout the school year. So this definition is a definition we're going to kind of move forward with throughout this. Now, of course, you're welcome to ask clarifying questions or push us back. All of this, we're citing all of our sources. And so, I mean, I'm not personally guaranteeing I understand all of this above reproach. So feel free to push me back if any of this. But formative assessment is a planned ongoing process used by all students and teachers during learning and teaching to elicit and use evidence of student learning to improve student understanding of intended disciplinary learning outcomes and support students to become self-directed learners. Ordinarily, I would not read straight off a slide, but when it's a definition, I like to do that so that we make sure that we're all on the same page. So you don't skip over that, you actually take time to read it. So this is how I want to frame this next piece. I love this question. I can't take credit for it. Lindsay thought of it, not me. But I want you to go ahead and head to that Padlet link right there. And the question we're going to explore is, how would you explain formative assessment to a parent or guardian in your classroom? Okay? Because the question isn't whether or not you can memorize that big definition with all that vocab in it. The question is, can you internalize this thing and help it make sense to your students and your students' parents so that as you start making decisions about the experiences they're having in the classroom, you're able to make sense of why it's valuable and why you've designed it and built it the way that you have. This allows a student to showcase their current knowledge and mastery of a skill. I like the word showcase. That really changes it. Lindsay said this earlier. The idea of sort of like reframing the idea of making a mistake. Like you want the students to make mistakes. I mean, you don't want them to make mistakes. You want them to learn everything that you do perfectly. But like you would rather they made the mistakes visibly so that you can see them rather than have those misconceptions and you not be able to know that they're there. I guess that's a better way to put it. I would prefer my students not make mistakes. I prefer I teach them things and then they're able to do everything I taught them perfectly. Are the small checks I use to make sure that your student is understanding the lesson? It might be a mini quiz or just a single question or task that I observe to make sure that everyone is on track. That way I can catch students before they fall behind. There's a what, there's a why, and there's a how. I like that. To understand that this is an ongoing learning process supported by teacher feedback and student reflection. Ooh, I like the word reflection. The goal is that I know what the students are thinking. Not much more to it. I mean, really, I just need to know. I need to open a window to their brains and see inside. I would think that those are all pretty good.
So one thing that came up for me as you were talking earlier about sort of the process and deciding on technology tools, I found this a little bit of a challenge because I feel like a lot of students and even teachers are overwhelmed by like, oh, today we're using Padlet, and tomorrow we're using Flipgrid, and so it's nice to say like we're going to use the tool that best meets the need of that particular formative assessment. But there's also something driving me towards just like pick one or two tools and use those, even if the other tools have advantages, just because people's bandwidth is really getting stretched right now.
I agree with that completely. And so I want you to know that everybody else, Will is not a paid person in this. He's properly set up our feedback talk and he's properly set up our question 3 technology talk too. I think that's just great minds. Tim and Lindsay are on the same page. All right. We'll get that. You're absolutely right. Everything you're saying is right down the middle based on what we're saying. And the reason I know it's right is because I agree with it. So So we will unpack that a little bit more, because yes, there's a basic tug of war between wanting to pick the just right tool, but recognizing that there's a cost associated with bringing a new tool into the mix. And so, yes, we'll get there for sure.
I'll add that anytime, the research has shown that anytime teachers try and add more than 2 or 3 new things at a time, instruction deteriorates. And my heart feels foul right now, because in a matter of hours, sometimes you've been thrown way more than 2 or 3 new things to try at one time. And so, yeah, Will, like what you said resonates, and I think we both agree completely. You have a ton on your plate.
I would like to add to that too, is listening to what Will's comments are, is looking at the tool, but you also have to look at the kids in terms of, are these tools accessible by all the kids? To be able to get a true formative assessment from a kid, from students.
And that's a fair point too. Like, how many of us, I taught Algebra 1 and I taught middle school math, and how many times was my word problem really only a reflection on the fact that the students couldn't read all that well? It wasn't a reflection at all on their ability to do the mathematics. And so recognizing that the accessibility piece, you might be getting data that reveals something to you, but it might not be telling you what you think it's telling you. So let's explore question 1.
Yeah, so we promised you we had 3 questions we wanted to answer. And the first is, how do we create a system where formative assessment is an authentic value add to your classroom, as opposed to something that feels more like a hoop to jump through? We know that as teachers, you have a lot of competing priorities. And so we want to take some time to explain a little bit more about the formative assessment process so that it feels manageable and so that your students get those same benefits that have been uncovered in the research literature. So this cycle right here has been adopted by the Michigan Department of Education. And the reason I bring this up is because one big misconception about formative assessment is that it is a thing, when really formative assessment is a process. And you'll see that in this cycle, this process, students are at the center. And that's for a really important reason. We acknowledge that student relationships are a huge precursor to effective formative assessment for a variety of reasons. I mean, in the words of Andrew Shaver, we want authentic displays of confusion. When our students are confused, we want them to feel safe telling us. When we give them feedback, we want them to have a relationship with us that encourages them to go use that feedback as opposed to push back or ignore us. So after acknowledging, Andrew, go ahead, thank you. After acknowledging that students are at the center, we have 3 observable practice dimensions. And the first one is where teachers establish a common understanding of the learning targets. And so they do this by planning lessons that are rooted in content knowledge, effective pedagogy, knowledge of their students. They design learning progressions that connect new learning to what's been done in the past and what's coming up in the future. And then they also, one of the most important parts of this step is that they provide models of mastery work. They make sure that students know what it would look like to accomplish that learning target. When teachers are ready, they elicit evidence of student understanding. And so this is done through skillful questioning, allowing for self-assessment as appropriate. Ultimately, they're just trying to check for understanding from all students. And this is the part of the process that's easier in theory than in execution. And so we'll get to this a little bit in a couple of slides, but we know that skillfully using questions and eliciting true evidence of understanding is an art. So the final observable practice dimension actually has 2 components. The first is where the teacher provides formative feedback, and then after that, they use decisions about what happened on the assessment to influence their future instruction. So feedback is what drives the learning forward, and thankfully this feedback can come from the teacher, it can come from peers, it can come from the student himself. So teachers don't need to feel this pressure to give all of the feedback themselves. But then the adjustments, that 4th step that teachers make to instruction, are really the hallmark of this whole process. So a word about evidence. We had talked about how in that 2nd step, you're eliciting evidence of understanding and you're skillfully using questions. When you're trying to garner evidence, a couple of things to keep in mind. You want to design your question or your task so that if students are successful, you know it's for the right reason. They didn't just guess or use an improper strategy to get to the final result. You want to know that they've actually mastered what it is you're teaching. But then if they're unsuccessful, you want to have a fighting chance of diagnosing whatever it was that led them to get that answer wrong. So I just have a couple of examples down at the bottom, and I acknowledge that these are a little bit extreme. I was trying to help make a point. So how could these questions be improved? The first one just says, is pen a noun? I'll pause in just a second and get some of your ideas, but I'm noticing right away that this question has some issues. One, pen isn't used in a sentence, and so are we expected, like, are we going to pen a letter, or are we going to use a pen to write a letter? Is it a noun or a verb? What are we getting at? Another big thing is that it's a yes or no question. Students could just guess yes or no and get the question correct. So do you guys have any ideas of how we might be able to improve this question to actually make sure that we can get a better understanding of what students are thinking and understanding? But I would even adjust that first word of the question. Rather than asking, is pen a noun, asking, how do we know that pen is a noun? Doing exactly what was mentioned, using pen in a sentence, and then asking students to give a little bit more of a narrative. How do we know that it's a noun? And the second question, a typical elementary math standard, what is the area of the rectangle? A couple problems that I noticed right away as a former elementary teacher, that a lot of students mix up area and perimeter. But unfortunately, 6 times 3 for the area and 6 plus 6 plus 3 plus 3 for the perimeter end up both leading to 18. So if I was going to adjust this question, I could just have students show their work. That might be one way to get better evidence, or I could change the numbers and make sure that being predictive about what errors my students commonly make, and then trying to make sure that students can't use those errors and get the right answer is one approach.
I do want to say, I don't want to understate, trying to diagnose the misconception or mistake sitting under an incorrect attempt is actually one of the most difficult parts of teaching. Like, so that's hard to do. So crafting a question so that you can sort of know like why a wrong answer is wrong is super valuable. If you can put in a little more work crafting the question carefully so that you have, I like the way Lindsay put it, a fighting chance of understanding why a misconception or a mistake happened. Because sometimes it is a misconception. I really thought this was right and I did it and it's wrong. Or I thought I was doing the right thing and you probably were, you just fumbled something up. And with math, we see that a lot.
Yeah. And the great thing about technology now is that we don't, when a great question is crafted, we don't have to keep that to ourselves. Or when someone in, California crafts a great question, we can take and we can use that in our classroom. So we don't need to feel the pressure to perfect all of our questions on our own. So jumping into question 2, I'm going to try and build a case for why I think we should balance graded and ungraded formative assessment, or if possible, not grade formative assessment at all. But I want to start by getting back to what Will was talking about with feedback. Good feedback, first and foremost, provides information that students can use. It is not just stating what is right or wrong. It is a recipe for future actions. It gives students steps that they can take. So I like to think about this as, when I go to the doctor and she tells me, Lindsay, you need to lose weight. That is not helpful feedback. I know I need to lose weight. I have a mirror, I have a scale, I got all kinds of things telling me that. What I don't know how to do is how to lose weight or how to, keep myself on a plan. And so if she were to give me feedback that said something such as, Lindsay, I want you to use this log and I want you to log your calorie intake. And at the end of the day, I want you to make sure that you're under 1,600 calories a day. That's more helpful for me. That gives me tangible steps that I can take to get closer and closer to success. Second, we want feedback to be given at the proper time. And this is actually a little bit stickier than what a lot of people think it might be. The research says timely feedback, but then what constitutes timely is up for major debate. Some researchers believe that immediate feedback is best, especially when learners are in the early acquisition phase of a new skill. Others rely on research about what we know about memory, and they say that delayed feedback is much more effective. So rather than giving you a certain number of minutes or days that I feel like you should wait, I'll just say, professional judgments about when it's best for students to receive feedback is appropriate. So we don't want to give feedback so soon that we're scaffolding the formative assessment and we're skewing our results. If we want to know that students can do something independently, then as hard as it is, we need to give them some of that space. But at the same time, we want to make sure, a couple people have already mentioned it, that we're not moving on to new material and not giving students a chance to use the feedback. So we don't want to delay it too much. And then finally, we need the student to be willing and able to take and use the feedback. And this can be tricky because of all the components of effective feedback. This is the one that we don't have as much control over. Sure, we can keep it concise and we can use student-friendly language. We can't force students to use it. So to help with this, we can relate feedback to the goal, and we can comment more on the work or the process rather than the student. And we'll talk about this more in just a minute as well. So a lot of research supports this belief that feedback is crucial to learning. This is why we see so many workshops on it, and we have so many supervisors coming in and monitoring the feedback in our classroom. I've just listed a couple of examples here. A study done in 1985 showed that students that were given constructive feedback as opposed to just scores learned twice as fast as the students that were just given scores. John Hattie and his colleague did what's called a meta-analysis, and they found numerous studies and came to the conclusion that when quality feedback is combined with good instruction, that it enhances learning. However, one of the greatest phenomenons in psychology research is that feedback intended to improve performance doesn't always do that. Sometimes the research shows that learners would have actually been better off if we had never given them feedback. And this is really confusing. Why? Why does this happen? And the reason is because how students react to the feedback matters. So a couple of studies to unpack this a little bit. The first was done by Kluger and Denisi, and noticing a trend in the research literature that feedback was not always effective, they went and looked for every single study on feedback that had ever been done in schools, colleges, or places of work over a period of 90 years. And they found a total of 131 studies that met their quality criteria, and those studies reported 607 experimental results. Now, usually studies report more than one experimental result, hence the discrepancy in numbers. Of those 607 results, 231 produced negative findings. They lowered student performance. That's huge. That's like over a third of the studies. So they went ahead and they did some digging to try and understand why. And they found a couple of key themes. Students respond to feedback in different ways. Some of these ways are helpful, like when they meet a goal, they set a new, harder goal. Some of these ways are not helpful, like ignoring the feedback or giving up or lowering their standard. And it's difficult to predict which way students will respond. But in general, if teachers are trying to get their students to respond in a more positive way, feedback effectiveness decreases as attention moves away from the task and closer to the self. So when teachers could keep the feedback task specific as opposed to talking about the student, students tended to have more positive reactions.
And that's like the difference between, I like the way that you solved this problem and so-and-so got this because she's a hard worker.
Right.
One of those is feedback directed at the task. One is directed at the person.
Exactly. So in an even earlier study done by Ruth Butler, she investigated feedback in 5th and 6th grade classrooms, and all students in the study were given 2 tasks. The first was a word construction task, and the second was a test of creative thinking. So all of the students took this test. 2 days later, their work was returned, and she broke the students up into 3 groups. Some of the groups were given a comment on how their work could improve. Some were given just a grade indicating their performance. And then the third group was given a comment and a grade side by side. Students took the test again, and the results were a little surprising. Students that were given a comment scored 30% higher on average on their second attempt than on their first. But then when she asked students, do you want to keep learning this content? They all demonstrated a desire to continue. They were motivated. Students that received a grade made no progress. In fact, their mean score went down. And when they were asked whether or not they wanted to continue learning, those who received high grades said, yeah, let's keep going. And those who received low grades said, yeah, no way. Now, when we think about the group that got a grade and a comment, we would like to think that, maybe they got a combination of those results. Like maybe their results were positive, like the students who got the comment. But what she found was that effect was the exact same as giving grades alone. She found that students, when they got their assessment back, the very first thing they looked at was their grade. And students that got a high grade didn't feel the need to read the comments. And students that got a low grade didn't want to read the comments. So grades completely washed out the benefit of comments. And so what this says to me is that we have some teachers that spend a whole lot of their very valuable time crafting excellent feedback. And then when it's paired with a score or a letter grade, all of that time that they put into that is quite possibly wasted. Additional studies, such as the one by Lipnovich and Smith, have had similar outcomes. Detailed feedback was strongly correlated with increased student improvement. Praise and grades were a bit more nuanced, but they found that descriptive feedback was the most effective when it was unaccompanied by grade or praise. Ruth Butler, in an even earlier study, had once again given students 2 tasks and divided them up into 4 conditions. This time it was students who received grades on their work, comments, written praise, and then no feedback. And she found that after their second attempt, she gave them a questionnaire asking them to describe how much effort they extended and their feelings of success. And she found that ego-involving feedback, what students had indicated on the questionnaire as ego-involving feedback, which was grades and praise, led to reduced learning, but task-involving feedback, like comments, bolstered learning. So what does this mean? Praise and grades have their place. We are not suggesting that these things should go away, but when giving formative feedback, it's much more effective to focus on the learning goal or the task, and to remind students that ability is not fixed. We want to keep them focused forward. So I love this quote as well. It says, feedback should cause thinking. If your feedback causes a thinking reaction, then there's a chance that some learning might happen. If your feedback causes an emotional reaction, then there's no chance that learning will take place. So our 2 cents, the first is that we know grading is really complicated. I was part of giving a survey to our high school students at our own ISD this spring, and the students that did not participate in online learning, we asked them why. And a huge chunk of parents and students said, oh, well, it wasn't graded, so it must not have been important. So I know that this is a sticky topic when it comes to students, parents, administrators, the whole shebang. So we would first recommend that you follow your district's policies. If they have some sort of procedure that you're supposed to follow with that, we understand. However, knowing that grades can hinder learning, we also want to provide students with plenty of opportunities to receive formative feedback without recording their performance in the grade book. We want classroom environments where students feel comfortable taking risks, attempting challenges, learning from mistakes. And even just philosophically, when students are in the process of learning something, there's a question of how fair it is to record that performance as a permanent mark in a grade book.
Do you guys have any thoughts or questions about that? The grading issue can be a little tricky, and oftentimes, grades are the currency that we kind of trade with at times. So it's like we want to push your thinking on that, but we understand that might cause some cognitive dissonance. What about credit for completion versus a grade? I think as far as the recording goes, there's a couple things going on there. When it comes to recording grades, of course, you got to follow school policy, and that's going to drive a lot of that. Okay, but one of the things, the image I have in my head is like, what's the difference between a supervisor telling me that I need you to learn this thing and we're going to talk about it, versus a supervisor telling me I need you to learn this thing and it'll be a quiz at the end and you got to get 3 of the 4 questions right in order to pass the thing, right? It changes the dynamic when you know the minimum grade, because all you're trying to do is hit that minimum grade just by the presence of a minimum grade being there. And so like, I think of football players who want to stay eligible and all they need is a D to stay eligible. And as long as they keep getting C+ on quizzes, they're fine. Like they don't want to read the feedback. They don't want to go back and think more about things. They just want to keep getting higher than a D because they're going to stay eligible for football. Right? If I remove that grade from that, it changes the whole dynamic of that experience. And while I may not be able to report that thing out as well, that actually also might be a good thing, because now I don't have to report it. Now we're just having a conversation about a topic that I'm telling this young person, I believe you can learn this, and you haven't learned it yet, and give it another try, and let's see if we can get it right this time. You know what I'm saying? Like it just changes the dynamic, as opposed to, you got about a B- on this one, and they'll go, I'm good with B-. Next, right? It just changes the whole conversation. So just, sorry, one more thing, Catherine. I've not read anything specifically in the research about credit for completion versus a grade. I think I totally understand where you're coming from, wanting to just mark that students are getting it done and that they're completing their assignments. So I don't know entirely how to answer your question, but I will get your email from the registration list. And if I ever come across anything, if I come across any studies or summaries, I would be happy to send those your way. All right, so let's get into question 3. How many tech tools does it take for a teacher to have an effective classroom formative assessment system? Okay. Now, the answer from my perspective, from our perspective, is the minimum number of tools you need to do what you need to do. Get away with using as few tools as you can possibly get away with. Okay. And the idea for this is two things. First, each tool is a disruption. Every time you bring new tools, you're bringing in new barriers, you're bringing in new processes, you're bringing in new vocab, new interfaces, right? There's a whole set of new learning that has to go on every time a new tool is brought into play. So you want to make sure that you really need to do that, okay? The second piece of that, though, is understanding what the tools that you have available to you can do, okay? So knowing that if you've got these tools, and some of them are going to be digital and some of them are not going to be digital, right? Recognizing in general what they do, there's value in that because you're going to start out with, all right, so let's suppose that you are starting out with Google Classroom and the Google Suite. Okay, there's a lot going on there. You've got slides, you've got all the tools built in the classroom, you've got forms, you've got all these different tools. If it were me, I would maximize those tools. Get everything you can out of those tools because you want the students to be able to come back to the same tools again and again and again so that they know what they're doing. So that when students who need a certain accommodation are able to work really well with a tool, you can lean on that tool heavily because you don't want to have to exacerbate some of those issues. Or if you've got students who are learning a brand new tool and interferes with them being able to show you what they know about the learning, right? Now, when you realize there's a hole in your system in the sense that you're trying to gather a piece of evidence that the tools you have available to you aren't able to do, now you go out for a new tool. But then with thought number two, knowing what those tools can do, now you know what you're looking for. So one of the things that's a little tricky with the Google tools is the free draw. That's just not something they do. Or something like dragging and moving things around on the screen. You can set those up, but it's a little bit labor intensive. So what do you do for that? If you realize that the evidence you need would be really easily gathered if you could build that type of experience for the students, well, you have to go out then and hunt for something that does that thing. And that's where you touch base with the people in your district or the people around you. You reach out to people like me or Allison or Christy who know things and have experience with different types of tools. Okay. But knowing that Poll Everywhere or Kahoot or Pear Deck or Desmos, these tools exist. And in general, what they sort of do helps you then identify how you can fill the gaps. So you take the tools that you got, you maximize them and use them for as much as you can possibly get out of them. And then when you see a gap in terms of a type of evidence you're trying to gather that the current tools you have available to you aren't able to really do very well, then you go out and find a tool that does that thing. Okay. And that's sort of both sides of this. That's sort of recognizing that there are tools out there that do some things really, really well, but that you only want to add a new tool to your system when it's a high value add because there's a cost associated with it. Adding a new tool is going to create a cost, and that's an investment that you're making, and you want to make sure that there's a return on that investment. Now, when it comes to exploring these tools, you want to be able to invest a little bit of time in exploring these tools so that you have a sense of what they do. Okay, so there's 3 pro tips I've put on this. Okay, the first one is tools often have YouTube channels. Okay, so if you want to know what a tool does, go watch the videos that tool is made, teaching people how to use that tool. So Pear Deck and Desmos are 2 great examples of tools that have really good YouTube channels that if you spent 10 or 15 minutes watching a variety of videos on those YouTube channels, you'd have a pretty good sense of what that tool does. And you know what you need, and now you have a sense of what that tool does, and you can make a decision about whether or not that has potential to actually fill the gap you have in your system, right? So explore YouTube, and I found you can find both of those. I mean, I put links in there, but like just by going to the search bar in YouTube and typing the tool that you're looking for. You'll either find videos from people like me, or you'll find that company themselves, that actual vendor, will have a YouTube channel and they'll have their own videos. The second thing is, keep in mind that people like me who make videos, we usually like to try to give you a sense of what that tool does in a way that doesn't require you to invest that much time. So like my 3-minute instructional text series is all about taking no more than 3 to 4 minutes of your time, having you have a sense of what a tool does, and having you have a sense of how to work with it. It's not going to make you an expert, but it is going to give you a sense of whether or not that tool is worthy of further exploration. And more importantly, if you look at 5 tools and you realize that 4 of them aren't worthy of exploration, you have just saved yourselves 3 or 4 hours worth of work that you otherwise would have done to get to the same outcome. Okay, but keep in mind as you're searching through these, you want to look for tools that are fairly new, or excuse me, not tools, rather, videos that are fairly new, because tools update and change, fairly short, less than 5 minutes if you can find them, and have lots of views, which means that these tools are getting shared by the people who watch them. Somebody watches the video and then shares it, okay? Third pro tip, make sure the tool is trustworthy. We don't want to expose our students to unnecessary risk, okay? So terms of service and privacy statements often really aren't that difficult to look through. I mean, they have a reputation of being really like legally sounding and stuff, but they often are not. And so, so give those a look and make sure that you're not running your students through a tool that you've never heard of and is also trying its best to take advantage of all your students' data and sell it to third parties for targeted advertising. Also, Common Sense Media can help. That link right there, it'll take you to their database, their searchable database of tech reviews. They've got teaching and learning reviews. They've got community reviews, and they've got data privacy reviews that they've done that can give you a sense of whether or not this tool is worthy of further exploration.
Well, yeah, I'm still thinking about what Lindsay talked about earlier too, with the formative assessment and grading and making comments. That's kind of what would blow my mind on because in my mind I saw formative assessment as kind of data points that we could check for understanding, kind of, and that maybe it's a basic or simplistic way of looking at it. Because I always worry, my background is special ed, and I always worry about kids not being able to perform well on the supplemental assessments and thinking, oh, we could look back and see how well they did for that. But there's a deeper thinking and deeper meaning to those formative assessments than just a data point to see, for the grades. So it's something to really think about. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks. I appreciate your thoughts on it, and I agree with everything you said. Alicia, you actually reminded me there have been researchers that have attempted to give feedback separately, to not let students know that it's graded and then to bring in the grading piece later. I'm not as familiar with that research, but I know that it's been explored, and so I would be curious if that's a possibility. Like maybe we grade it, but we don't necessarily make that the piece that we give back to students right away. Maybe we give them the feedback first and then have that follow up. That would be an interesting thing to explore. Yeah, and so much of that is that mindset piece that Will brought up early. Like those comments, in order for those comments to be powerful and impact the learning, they have to be absorbed by the students. And there's a little bit of timing and relationship and the manner in which they're given. I mean, like there's a lot of pieces that kind of play into that. But
Lindsay, something you said reminded me that like we only see kids every other day, basically. So there's a lot of in-between time. And I'm using a tool called Go Formative. And what that allows me to do is see the kids work in real time. Like as they're typing, I can, if I happen to be looking, I can see what they're typing and they're spelled something wrong, they delete it. But the other thing that's nice is I can give them feedback on each question in an assignment. And so it's very specific. And I can give them that feedback while they still know they have another 14 hours to finish it. So it's kind of plays into what you're talking about, where they get that feedback. They know that like the grade is coming, but they're getting the feedback while they have a chance to do something about it. So that's been kind of interesting and very different dynamic than I'm used to with paper, right?
Right. Summative assessments are important. We do need to have a report of student learning that we can share. But yeah, giving them lots of opportunities to revise their work and to refine their learning before we give that, you know, summative number or summative letter is super important. Yeah. Catherine, I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about self-assessment, but there's generally a lot of positive findings in the research literature when it comes to rubrics and students using those rubrics to self-evaluate before the student ever, or before the teacher, excuse me, ever takes it and gives feedback. So I think that's a great idea, and I think it's supported by a decent amount of evidence.
Would you say that in order for that to be effective, that the students would have to have like a reasonable understanding of the learning target? Or is that something where, I mean, obviously they have to have some, like, how would you prep them to understand what mastery looked like as far as comparing their own work to that?
Yeah, the best answer to that is just lots and lots and lots of examples. Yes, Catherine, lots of modeling, giving them plenty of exposure to what high quality responses look like.